During the Second World War, I was 7 years and 3 days old when the Pearl Harbor occurred and the Japanese bombed our ships there in the Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. I wasn't very much aware of the news back then. We didn't have television, so we might have heard it on the radio. We didn't get newspapers out clear in the country, and so I wasn't much aware of what was going on, except that we were in war. And for some reason or other, the Japanese in our community were really concerned, because now, as I look back and learn, the Japanese in the United States were being encamped in camps, concentration camps, all around the country. There was only one place in the United States where the Japanese were not forced into these encampments, and that was Ontario, Oregon. And the reason is because there were a number of really prominent and successful farmers up there that were Japanese, our neighbors. And they were important to the economy, producing food for our economy as we went into the war. Because it was, even though there had been a war in Europe before that, it was that Pearl Harbor bombing that brought America into the war full-fledged. And so America turned into a big war machine. Instead of the manufacturers manufacturing cars and farm equipment and other kinds of things, they started manufacturing tanks and guns and airplanes, and it was a big deal. And the whole country dedicated itself to that Second World War. There were 1 million of our boys or more, young men, that got killed in that war. One of them was my uncle, who was a pilot in England, flying pilot or airplane sorries over into Germany in a B-17 bomber, dropping bombs on Germany to try to cripple them and end the war there. He became the squadron leader of his squadron of airplanes, and then when he was finally finished with his tour, he was relieved by another squadron, another group, but the co-pilot on one of those leading planes got ill with the flu. And so my uncle, Hugh Calvin Doman, offered to substitute for him. And they took off in their plane. It was a cloudy day in England. And in those days, they used these big fields, dirt fields, to land their planes in. And that big airplane field where they took off from up northeast of Birmingham is now back into a farm. But there's a large monument there to that group of airmen who flew out of there. But he took off, and for some reason or other, he came down around, took off towards the west and circled down around towards London, and then circled and started to cross towards Germany. But as they came out of the clouds, as they were in the clouds in that circling, one of the engines on their plane caught fire. And so they were losing altitude. It's maybe a 4-engine plane, or maybe it's only a 2-engine plane, I'm not sure. But they were losing altitude, and they were coming out of the plane, coming out of the clouds. A 13-year-old boy in a place called Wargrave, England, saw this whole thing. And I have since met him, and he's written about it and talked about this event. This plane was coming right towards the village of Wargrave on fire. But the radioman who survived tells the story that they were going to start dropping their bombs, but so that they could then ditch the plane because they didn't want it to hit and explode. So they decided to hang in the plane and turn up the River Thames, which, by the way, circles around and goes through London. And they were starting to drop their bombs in the River Thames when their plane exploded, and killed everyone on board except for the radioman, and he parachuted down. This 13-year-old boy in Wargrave saw the whole thing and has recorded it, and there's articles in the Reading newspaper that year, and then 50 years later in celebration of that event, calling these airmen American war heroes because they had stayed with the plane and they think saved the lives of a lot of people in their village. Anyway, that was Uncle Hugh. My two other uncles, Sonny Hickey and Oscar Hickey, were in the Navy in the South Pacific, and both of them got their ships sunk. They were kamikaze. Japanese planes came crashing into the decks of their planes and blew up, and they had to abandon ship, and so that was pretty dramatic, but they both came home safely. During that Japanese encampment, they instead of forcing the Japanese in our community into these encampments, they let them stay there to produce food, and they also allowed Japanese from other camps, if they wanted to come and work on the farms, to allow them to come there and work on the farms there in Ontario. Some young man that came there when we were in the very first grade, his name was Teddy Sakano. His dad was one of those who wanted to come and work in the farms. Teddy, I have to tell you, later became the valedictorian of our high school and a dear friend, and he is a chemistry professor now in New York City, or New York State someplace. But there were a large number, a good percentage of the students in our high school class that were Japanese because of that. And we didn't even know the difference whether they were Japanese or others. Even though there was a war going on, we never did have any feelings toward them. There was a fellow next door, about a half a mile away from us, which we called next door, a Japanese fellow named Joe Watanabe, and we all, us kids, imagined that he was a spy for the Japanese and that he had this two-way radio and that he was spying on us and giving information to the Japanese. We called him Tokyo Joe, but we were afraid of him, but that was our imagination. We played war games during the war. We had toy guns, and we ran around through the corrals hiding and shooting at each other, and I'm sorry, but I always had to be the commander. That embarrasses me now, but I wouldn't play if I wasn't the commander. Now, that's a terrible admission, but... So this war eventually came to an end. At the end of the war, I forgot to tell you that during the war, the Army sent up to Ontario a troop of soldiers, and they built a barracks and an Army encampment down about a half mile from our house, and they trained down there. They had a gun places where they practiced their marksmanship. They had logs and ropes that they had to climb and everything that they had to work out and train on. But they also were keeping their eye on the Japanese community. I think they were just there to intimidate them. But when the war was over, they brought German POWs there. They had these blue shirts with a big POWs on the back of their shirt. And they came out into our fields and hoed our beets, sugar beets. And it was really interesting for us boys to be sitting there looking out into our fields, seeing these German soldiers weeding our beets with American soldiers sitting on the ditch banks with machine guns all around guarding them. But when the war was over, the community turned this barracks over to the Japanese, and it became the Japanese Community Center. And those people stayed there and became a very important, prominent part of our community. And their religion had their preacher, their priest down there, and I remember going into the gymnasium there and going up on the stage and looking at the Buddha, which they had there that they worshipped. So it was a very interesting experience of us with the Japanese.